this computer. All right. Share the screen. Now I'm going to set up a few things on my computer here so I can see everybody. At least I can see the black boxes with all your names on them. All right, and now for my next trick. All right, hopefully you all can see what I'm seeing here. The first slide for the presentation, and if not, then I guess joke's on me. So again, today, welcome to Disasters in History. Today we are going to discuss the Triangle Waste Company fire that occurred in 1911 on March 25th. So I believe that is in 2 days, we have the anniversary of this horrible, tragic fire. So I wanted to give you this opportunity to learn about it from my perspective a couple days early. So maybe you can chat with your families about it, with your coworkers, with your audiences, for those of you who are in the risk reduction world across the country. All right, so here we go. So this is the Triangle Waste Company building, the Ash building, as it looks today over there on the right. And on the map here, this is Washington Place and Green Street in New York City. And like I say, that the building is still here. The insides look a little bit differently over the last 110 years, of course. But the building is still there. And for a lot of the tragic fires, a lot of the tragic incidents that I discuss in the presentations or in this series, those buildings, those sites are not recognizable from before the incident, but here it is, which is, I think it's kind of cool. So this building was constructed back in 1902, and it was constructed amid a bit of controversy, including the fact that it was one of the first 10-story buildings in New York City. And that's not a big deal today, of course, but back when this building was constructed, the fire department of New York only had ladders that reached 6 stories tall. And I don't know about you, but certainly in my past, in some of the smaller communities in Colorado, there's certainly been communities that have put in large buildings without having the fire apparatus or the technology to deal with potential emergencies in those buildings. Now, this building is 10 stories tall. It also had a basement, and we'll talk about the basement in a little bit. The basement, there was some electric lighting down there, but they also constructed this building so that in the sidewalk, there were skylights. Well, there were skylights for the basement, but they appeared in the sidewalk. And so when walking along the Washington Place or Green Street, you had to be careful where you stepped so that you wouldn't potentially break those skylights. The Triangle Waste Company first occupied the 9th floor of this building and eventually occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors, which are the top 3 floors of this building. So when the Ash building was first being considered, as you can see in the letter here from May 7th, 1900, the first building permit application was rejected. And it was rejected for several reasons, including the strength of the roof assembly, the number of exit staircases, the thickness of walls, and the fact that the exterior fire escape placed people, when they reached the bottom of the fire escape, they actually stepped off onto one of those skylights in the sidewalk, which the building department in New York City didn't think was appropriate. But I'm sure this never happens in the 21st century, but back then, the architect complained loudly enough and probably threw around a little bit of cash and incentives. The building department's concerns were overruled, and New York City changed its building code to allow this sort of structure to go up. So the building officials did the right thing at first, but then they were overruled by the power of New York City politics, of City Hall and what was back then called Tammany Hall. So The company is called the Triangle Waist Company. And in this case, the waist company was a reference to the shirt waist, which is a blouse basically that was available, and it was actually all the rage among women in 1910s in the United States, but especially the big cities like New York City. This blouse was appropriate for women to wear in most occasions, whether they were at work, they were eating out, they were recreating, and it was definitely a step up or a change for them from the more formal and no doubt horribly uncomfortable hoops, bustles, and corsets that they had worn through the Victorian era leading up to this time. So the black and white image there is from a newspaper advertisement, and then the photo is from the Smithsonian Magazine showing a couple different versions of the shirtwaist. There were hundreds of companies in New York City in particular making these blouses or these shirtwaists, including the Triangle Waist Company. The Triangle Waist Company was owned by these two men, Max Planck and Isaac Harris. They were both immigrants from Ukraine. In 1900, they founded the Triangle Waist Company, and then in 1902, they moved into the 9th floor of the Ash Building, which again was at Washington Place and Green Street. And over the next 10 years, they expanded their company into the 9th and 10th floors. So at the time, the Triangle was the largest shirtwaist factory in New York. They started business together when Isaac, again on the right, married one of Max's cousins. And so they had the business together, but they also owned other businesses together, and they were in businesses by themselves as well. So they were quite the entrepreneurs for being recent immigrants. They certainly had found the American dream, pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, and were living large in New York City at the turn of the previous century. Now I want to catch up on my notes here. I apologize. So this is what the image here on the right, this is what the Triangle's 9th floor looked like. But let's think about all three of the floors that the Triangle owned by 1909. On the 8th floor, that's where the cutters were. On the 9th floor, that's where people were doing the sewing. And then the 10th floor, the top floor of the building, that's where management and shipping were located. The workers were required to use the freight elevator, which is on the lower right-hand side of the screen here, of the slide. Only customers and management could use the other elevators, the non-freight elevators, which were on the upper left at the off of Washington Place there. Now the 8th floor, so looking back at the 8th floor, and I don't have a graphic of that, the 8th floor, because that's where the cutters were, that floor was full of fabric and paper. Patterns were made of paper, and then the cutters, all men, used sharp knives to cut through the multiple layers of fabric at the same time. Now, their job was to get as many patterns out of the available fabric as possible. So the best ones were able to have basically no waste in the fabric. And because they were also good at cutting the fabric with as little waste as possible, they were given extra benefits, including the ability to smoke on the 8th floor while they were working. Now, the Ash Building itself had a strict no smoking policy, but Blank and Harris allowed the cutters on the 8th floor to smoke as a reward for keeping the cost down as much as possible. That might come back to haunt us here. Now, the 9th floor, which is pictured here in the graphic, the 9th floor was a jungle. You can see the hashed lines there. Those were tables, and along the tables were drive shafts underneath the tables that powered the sewing machines. Imagine chairs on each side of each table, and the floor also held the workers' coats and bags, as well as wicker baskets full of fabric waiting to be sewed, or shirtwaists that had already been produced that were waiting to be moved upstairs to the shipping department. There were also jugs of oil on the floor and throughout the floor space there for the sewing machines and for the drive shafts. And then up on the 10th floor, there was still fabric up there because that was the shipping department, as well as furniture, files, paper, that sort of thing. So in reality, floors 8, 9, and 10 of the Ash building were full of fuel. Now, the working conditions, this is not a photo from the Triangle Waste Company, but it is a photo from another factory where they were sewing garments. In 1911, the Triangle factory had 500 employees spread over those 3 floors. The workers put in 52 hours a week, working Monday through Saturday, and they had roughly a 7.5-hour day on Saturdays. If you can do the math for the remaining hours, that's I don't know, it's like 9 hours a day for the other days. Several of the survivors noted that there was no talking allowed on the floor between workers because the supervisors and by extension then the bosses felt that workers who were talking to each other were wasting time, which is wasting money, and the Blank and Harris didn't want to lose any money on the gig, so no talking was allowed. Now, talking would have been difficult, though, because there were so many immigrants who were working in the building. A lot of them didn't speak English. A lot of them spoke Yiddish, spoke other languages. So even talking between people could have been difficult. The doors were locked and or chained in the, especially on the 9th floor, to prevent the employees from taking breaks without permission. And for when they did have a permission to take a break, to prevent those employees from taking too long on their break. Supervisors always followed the employees into the bathroom to make sure that there was no extra time being lost in the bathroom. The employees were often shortchanged on their pay. The machines, the drive shafts, the sewing machines were incredibly loud. And then at the end of each shift, at the end of each day, employees were searched to make sure they weren't taking any shirtwaists or any fabric with them, taking that home with them so they weren't stealing from the company. Another thing to note is that in these businesses back in the day, there were no fire drills. Men and women worked for the Triangle. Again, lots of different languages are spoken. It was a tough life for these men and women who were working there. Now, I mentioned this a little bit before, that there was a no smoking policy in the building, except for the cutters on the 8th floor. And so they would place their patterns on sheets of fabric, multiple sheets at once, to cut all the pieces out. And then they would just toss the waste tissue and the waste fabric into bins that were all over the floor. And those bins were also where they threw their cigarette butts. And for the most part, the cigarette butts were properly extinguished, but not always. And again, for those of us who may need the refresher, of course, we're on the earth, so we have plenty of oxygen. The improperly disposed of smoking materials are the heat source and plenty of fuel. And so it should be no surprise to anybody that a fire eventually occurred here. And that fire occurred on March 25th, 1911 at approximately 4:40 p.m. So the fire started on the 8th floor. Surprise, surprise. There were 250 workers on the 8th floor, over 250 workers on the 8th floor, and 250 of them actually were able to escape. The fire broke from the 8th floor. The fire extended into the stairwell for the, over on the Green Street stairwell and into the freight elevator area. And from there, the fire both descended downward and ascended upward through the stairwell shaft. When the elevator operators learned of the fire, they moved the cars, the freight elevator and the people elevators. They went up to the 10th floor as quickly as they could so they could tell their bosses that there was a fire on the 8th floor. So many of the employees up on the 10th floor were able to take the elevators down to the lobby and outside. Others took ignored the elevators and they went out onto the roof, where they escaped to the adjoining roof of a building that was operated by New York University. Now, the elevators were going up and down these shafts so many times during the fire over the next 20, 30 minutes that many of the elevator operators were overcome with smoke. So that wasn't good for them. So the cutters on the 8th floor hosted the fire. They knew the fire was burning. They knew to get out quickly. Management and shipping department, they were up on the 10th floor. They were alerted to the fire's presence. But nobody stopped to tell the employees on the 9th floor that there was a fire. So eventually, 9th floor employees went to the elevator. They started seeing or smelling smoke. They went to the stairwell where the freight elevator is. They looked down and they saw the fire was burning. And it was time to get out. They went to the stairwells. But again, the stairwell for the freight elevator area on Green Street was blocked by fire.
Yeah, Porter was fast.
When the employees from the 9th floor went up to the Washington Place, not Washington Street, Washington Place exit, they found a locked door. And it was locked with a chain, it was locked with a bolt. They couldn't get out that way either. And the doors up here, incidentally, the doors also opened inward, which didn't help. I mean, it didn't matter at that point because the door was locked, but when they eventually got the door unlocked, then they had to push against themselves to get the doors to open so they could eventually escape. There was also a fire escape on the outside of the building, which is where my arrow is over here. But the fire escape can only handle so many people at one time. Some of the people who did escape onto the fire escape, or did leave the 9th floor onto the fire escape, they climbed down to the 6th floor, broke back into the building through those windows, and then went to the stairwell on Washington Place through someone else's business, and they were able to escape that way. But eventually the heat from the fire caused the metal fire escape to buckle and collapse. And I highlighted the 310 workers on the 9th floor. I don't know that we can stress enough in community risk reduction or preparedness, that sort of thing. Detection and warning systems for fire are so critical. And it's critical that we have the right number of exits. I've been working with one of my colleagues here in Colorado recently, or at South Metro. We've been working with an assisted living community on their evacuation plan and making sure that their residents will know quickly when there's a fire, and they know how to get out safely when there's a fire, and they will know where their exits are and know that they have to evacuate as well. So this is definitely something that's current. We think about this fire as back in the day in 1911, but these issues are still pertinent in March of 2021. Here's one of the testimonies from a survivor. When I went out into the hall staircase, I bent down, looked downstairs, and I could see fire come up. And that was the stairway at the freight elevator. Later in the shop, the girls were running around with their hair burning. And that's an image that reminds me of some of the testimonies from other tragic fires, whether it's the Coconut Grove or the Rhythm nightclubs, or even the Station nightclub back in 2003. Those others were in the 1940s, or other tragic fires where conditions in that room get so hot so quickly that we have to remember that humans are also fuel, not just our clothes, but our hair, our skin. A horrifying, horrifying incident. So these, I'm going to show some photos here from this incident. All the photos are from the Kiel Center for Labor Relations at Cornell University, unless they're noted otherwise on the slides. Amazing photographs. On the left, we've got a cart with FDNY firefighters responding. On the right, you can see that the ladders that the firefighters have, they can't get up to all the floors. They can get up to the 6th floor, but no higher than that. Ultimately, this fire was controlled in about 30 minutes, which is pretty fantastic. But 30 minutes was plenty of time for a ginormous tragedy to occur. At left, we've got the facade that was on the Washington Place side of the building. And then on the right, you've got, you can see Washington Place on the left and going down Green Street on the right there. Here, a couple of firefighters are moving a victim to a slightly safer location. I mean, you can see the ladder carts, the amount of hose that was stretched out over the street there. Amazing. This is one of the skylights that was on the sidewalk on, I believe this was on the Green Street side, or because this was underneath the fire escape, the buckled fire escape. And when you look at this, you may wonder what caused that hole in the skylight. And if you're thinking that it was one of the people who was on the fire escape, you're correct. That was a plummeting person who ripped the hole in the skylight there. So as the tragedy unfolds, we've got police officers and civilians over there on the left with several of the bodies. And then later in the evening, this was the effort of firefighters to remove some of the bodies from the upstairs spaces down to the street. This was an image from the 9th floor during the investigation, during the district attorney's office investigation into this fire. You can see the drive shafts underneath some of the tables there. You can get an idea as to the amount of heat based on the damage to the ceiling and all the charred wood down there on the floor. 146 people died in this fire. 23 were men, which meant that the other 123 were women. The victims were aged 14 to 43. Remember, this is a time when child labor was interpreted differently. And on the right here, we have some of the other garment workers from across New York City protesting the deaths and mourning the losses from this fire. This is the first of 3 slides. I wanted to include the list of the victims this time around. I didn't do this with the first time I did this presentation, but it's important for us to remember that 146 people, they were all people. You can see a lot of them that shared last names. That's no guarantee that they were siblings or parents, but certainly it was a tight community of immigrants there that were employed by the Triangle Waste Company. And as a historian, I'm less concerned about dates. For me, I'm more concerned about the human element of what happens in history. And this is a pretty overwhelming list. The funeral procession. 100,000 people walked in the procession, and there were an estimated 250,000 people lining the sidewalks, lining the way. This tragedy shook New York City to its core. And so there was an investigation. Someone was to blame. I mean, certainly this fire just couldn't have happened randomly and everybody gets away with it. District Attorney Charles Whitman and investigators interviewed dozens of survivors from this fire, as well as other people who worked in the garment district in New York City. And they kept hearing the same story, that the exit from the 9th floor was blocked by a lock, by a bolt lock. So the detectives, the investigators went back to the building and they searched the 9th floor, and a couple of laborers, I can't remember their names, but a couple of laborers actually found the lock for the Washington Place exit door underneath the rubble. They found, like the slide says, the bolt was protruding from the door, but it was undamaged. There was no smoke damage, there was no heat damage, which to Whitman suggested that the door frame had protected it until firefighters broke through and all the rubble came on top of it. Now, back in 1911 in New York City, failure to keep the doors unlocked in a factory was a misdemeanor. And a misdemeanor would any sort of misdemeanor that resulted in death was deemed to earn the charge of manslaughter. And that would mean a 20-year prison sentence. So imagine that 146 people died because of a locked door. So that could be 146 charges of manslaughter, and 146 times 20 is a lot of years in prison. But I'm a historian, not a math major, so someone else is going to have to do the math for me. Blanc and Harris were arrested on April 12th, 1911, so less than a month from after the fire burned. They were actually charged with only 6 counts of manslaughter based on 2 of the 146 deaths. And Whitman decided to just go with 2 of the deaths because after 2, there was really no more that prison time would, it was ridiculous at that point. But then the pretrial work eventually whittled down 2 deaths to just focusing on one woman's death and her death being linked to that locked door. Blanc and Harris, who didn't want to pay their workers any more than they had to, each paid this person, Max Stoyer, $10,000 to take the case and to be their defense attorney. And Stoyer was like it says on the slide here, he was a powerful force within City Hall. He had represented several indicted judges in the past. He had represented Big Tim Sullivan, who was a major source of corruption and power in New York City in the 1900s. And Stoyer took the job as long as he was paid appropriately. So the trial, survivors testified again and again and again that the door was locked. And that was the basis for the case that Whitman was making against Blanc and Harris. The defense argued that fire was blocking the Washington Place stairway, and so rather than the door blocking the stairway, that fire had blocked it. And that's because one of the first officers from the fire department who arrived on scene later testified that he saw flames in the stairwell area on the 9th floor on the Washington Place side. And so Stoyer, of course, jumped on that and said, well, if fire was blocking the stairwell, then it wouldn't matter what sort of doors were locked or unlocked, so there's no case there. Stoyer also, he wouldn't have called it the Wookiee defense back then or the Chewbacca defense, for those of you who are South Park fans, but he tried to twist and turn several of the words and the phrases of various survivors just to confuse the jury as well. But he didn't have to work too hard because the jury consisted of business owners rather than people who worked in the factories, and all the jury members were men as well. So really, he didn't have to work that hard to get most of the jury members to basically find on behalf of the defendants. And then the judge threw extra fuel on the fire. The judge instructed the jury to determine beyond a reasonable doubt, whether Harris and Blanc knew the door was locked at exactly 4:45 p.m. on March 25th, 1911. And when it comes to proving anything that someone else knew beyond a reasonable doubt, he set I would argue as a historian, he set the jury up so that the only thing they could do was to acquit Harris and Blanc. So they did. No 2 hours of deliberations, the 2 men were acquitted, everything went back to normal. But they didn't go back to normal for everybody. In terms of New York City after the fire, there was a new requirement for automatic sprinkler systems in high-rise buildings. That's a good thing. The technology certainly existed, but it hadn't been required to that point. Fire drills were suddenly required in larger shops and factories. And the terms here of the time, when you talk about a large shop, you're basically talking about a factory. More stronger fire escapes were required. The photograph on the right there, that's the buckled fire escape from the triangle or from the Ash building. Doors had to be unlocked throughout the workday and they had to swing outward. And New York City also created a Bureau of Fire Prevention after this incident. Nationally, the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, stepped up to the plate. It created the Committee on Safety to Life. It also developed the first of its building exits codes. There was new attention to workplace safety across the nation, but particularly in the industrialized Northeast. And that increased power among labor unions and increased power among the Democratic Party. Now, that was an odd mix at the time because New York City in 1911 was run by the Democratic Party. Tammany Hall was run by the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party was anti-union. After this fire, there was enough momentum and enough interest in protecting workers that this was when the Democratic Party switched allegiances and started to support labor unions. And speaking of switching allegiances, this fire and the public attention from this fire also led to new momentum for women's safety issues and the momentum for the women's suffrage movement, which also became one part of the platform for the Democratic Party. But before March 25th, 1911, New York's Democratic Party was, again, anti-union, anti-women, and anti-women's suffrage. So to me, as a historian, it's remarkable how one tragedy can change the relationships and the equity in politics. So lessons for us. And this is, I try to put these in all of the disaster presentations. It's so important to dispose of smoking materials properly. Several years ago, our colleagues with Arvada Fire out in northwestern Denver area, Arvada Fire Protection District, they had a string of home fires that were caused by improperly disposed of smoking materials. And they created this great program that was keep your butt out of the pot, because those cigarette butts were ending up in planters or potted plants. And of course, it's not just dirt with those potted plants, it's also fertilizers and compost and things that burn. And that program, that campaign helped stop that trend before it got any worse. Here at South Metro, we've had some recent home fires caused by smoking materials that were not put out properly. So disposing of smoking materials properly, always a good message for your communities. It's also important to keep heat sources away from fuel. That's fourth grade fire science, at least in my world. So let's remember our science from fourth grade and do better with that. It's also important to know your exits. I put a little asterisk on there because that was one of the lessons that we kept hearing from the horrible mass shooting in Boulder yesterday, that so many people in that King Soopers didn't necessarily know how to get out when the front door was compromised. So one of my colleagues here at South Metro, Colleen Potton, she encourages everybody, when we do our business safety program, she encourages people to imagine their grocery stores. And she's been teaching this for years. Imagine yourself in your grocery store. You're in the produce aisle, or you're at the bakery, or you're back at the deli, and suddenly the fire alarm turns on and you need to leave, but you can't go out the front door. Where's your closest exit? At the time of the emergency, that's not a good time to figure out what your closest or what your next exit is. So lesson learned from yesterday, lesson learned from the Triangle Fire, always know your exits. And the final one, of course, is fire drills save lives. So for those of you in my fire district, you know that we have a cool fire drill program where when families do home fire drills, if the kids are participating and they go out to their family meeting place, get a photo of the family out there, then they send us a photo of or an image of that family meeting place being used properly. Every one of the kids who's age 12 and younger receives from us a coupon for free ice cream at an ice cream place out here called Cold Stone. For those of you in the risk reduction world, I definitely encourage you to do similar programs to encourage families to do fire drills. And honestly, we need to keep pushing the fire drill messaging outside of the homes too, in businesses, assisted living communities, hospitals, places of worship, all those sorts of places. So yeah, fire drills save lives. Who knew? Here's the bibliography. That first book is amazing. David Von Dreely's Triangle, The Fire That Changed America. I've read that several times. I have not read The Triangle Fire by Leon Stein, but that was apparently a pretty important book at the time, and he interviewed many of the survivors who were still alive in the 1950s and early 1960s. And I'm going to reach across the building of the fire station here. I believe that the lieutenant here at Station 19 was telling me about a podcast. I can't remember what the podcast is called suddenly, Tom, but if you want to unmute yourself and share that with everybody, I'm looking at you. You can certainly do that.
Sure. The podcast is called American History Tellers. And so they do a lot of different things on history, but one of the ones was, I believe it was a 5 or 6 part series on the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. So if you go to American History Tellers podcast, and you could search for that and find that, it was really well done.
Thank you, Tom. The Kiel Center for Labor Management, Documentation, and Archives at Cornell University has a ton of resources on this fire. And of course, the NFPA has a ton of resources as well. So what I'd like all of you to do is jot down this survey, and I'm going to put it in the chat here in a moment as well. Before you're off the hook, I want you to fill out this survey. It'll help me evaluate what you may have learned, as well as who you are. And I mean, not any sort of HIPAA violations, of course, but where you are when you're watching this program. Again, as all of us in risk reduction know, it's important to take the evaluation seriously, help out a fellow risk reduction specialist. It's a good thing. And then here's our general email address. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to put that survey link in the chat box. And then you can find that there as well. You might even be able to click on it since it's hyperlinked. So you are welcome. Oh, clapping hands from Rob. Thanks, Rob. You are welcome to unmute yourselves and ask me questions if you would like. I appreciate your time. This is a slightly shorter presentation than some of the other ones that I do throughout the course of the year, but I definitely appreciate y'all being here. And I do want to mention before you start leaving, the next presentation I'll be doing, I believe, is on April 8th, and it's on a public health topic. This public health topic involves outhouses and the material that goes into outhouses. So I hope you all will join me for that. I believe it, again, let me check real quick. Stand by. Should have known that in advance. Yes, April 8th at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. So yeah, any questions? Please let me know. Otherwise, fill out that survey for me, and I'll see you guys out there. Oh, lots of appreciation. I appreciate that as well. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming from the West Coast and the East Coast and the Middle Coast. Anyway, those of us who are coast impaired, I appreciate that as well. Thank you for your positive feedback. All right.